really glad that the S. Fischer Stiftung had this wonderful idea to do a Skype interview with you again after Leipzig Book Fair got canceled because of this incredible damned coronavirus. Yeah, I'm really glad to talk to you because it's been a long time I've been knowing your work. And just in March, this was the first time we met in Berlin. So Saša, who doesn't know Saša, which is a surprise because he's like the one and only like famous comic artist in Serbia. He's from Pančevo, which is a city in Serbia. And he was born in Pančevo and he still lives in Pančevo, I think, which is quite an achievement today, where everybody is migrating around the world, usually. And that's actually my first question. I know you've been working for newspapers, you do cartoons, you do longer formats, comics, on a lot of historical stuff, a lot of contemporary stuff. How did it happen, Saša? Why is it that you were drawn to comics at the first place?
Actually, I started to work on comics as an experiment because before I started to work on a more or less professional base as a cartoonist, I was a journalist. So I was publishing my articles in several magazines way back in Yugoslavia in the 1980s. And then I started to make comics as an experiment. And it turned out that this experiment is something which is still going on. Mm-hmm. So it never stopped. I was looking for some new ways, new approaches to the comics. So I was experimenting with comics reports, a reportage kind of thing in a form of comic. But also I was doing dream comics, inspired by some of the interesting dreams. And one of the things which I like to do is to actually find some long forgotten piece of journalistic work or something and then illustrate it. So I work a lot on research through the archives. Yeah. And I like just to explore.
That's what I wanted to ask later, but first back to your personal background, because I mean, as far as I know, you're not a trained artist. You just like, I suppose, even as a kid, you probably just like to draw. I mean, it's a lot of work. So how did that happen? That you really would not only research stories and write about it, but also like draw them?
Yeah, I was always drawing as a kid, and I was thinking about drawing as a very interesting way of expression. At some point, I was actually very much interested into music as well. So I was a kind of a music journalist at one part of my career, so-called career. But for me, I think there is a sort of overwhelming power of drawing. It's something that anyone can do. You know, it's. I mean, children, they can do the perfect drawings, and also the people who are not trained artists or anything. I went to the design school, but I had a training in industrial design, which is quite far away from what I'm doing now. But as I said, I like to experiment with different forms and different forms of expression. So at some point, I just came across the comics as a very interesting, very expressive form where you can show your feelings, where you can speak about your mind. And I think it's in some way it's similar to the literature, to what people call the more serious literature, because comics are always on the brink.
That's true. Yeah.
It's always considered to be a kind of some kind of very a thing which is on the edge. But I think it's a wrong perception also, because I think if you combine a drawing and with the text, it's very powerful. You can actually say whatever you want.
Sorry to interrupt. That's an interesting thing that maybe you were well prepared to do so because former Yugoslavia was one of the few countries in the whole region of the so-called former Eastern Bloc, Eastern Europe, where you would have the possibility to read a lot of comics, even as a kid. So I
Yes.
suppose you read a lot of comics too, from all kinds of places.
That's true. Even when the time passed, we actually realized how colorful was the comic scene in ex-Yugoslavia, because we had both American comics and European ones. And from Europe, we have a lot of British comics, a lot of Franco-Belgian comics. And I just recently saw that somebody wrote, for example, it's just one example, but somebody wrote an article just about Hungarian comics, which were published in the Serbian magazines way back in the 80s and even maybe even the 70s. So it was it was the popular media, and it had some tradition because in the pre-war time, Yugoslavia was one of the countries with a very rich and productive comic scene. For example, Belgrade was the place where there were dozens of cartoonists who were active in the 1930s, before the Second War. And we only now realize that a lot of these materials that they produced were actually published abroad. There were some of those comics were published in the 1930s and the 1940s, for example, in France, in Italy, in Poland, even in Turkey and in Bulgaria. And recently we found out that some of these comics were published also in countries like Argentina and Brazil. So it was also in Sweden and Denmark. So it was
Yeah,
very
yeah.
spread. The translation of these early comics were quite spread. And after the Second War, it took some time, but in the 1950s, the comics were already back to the newsstands and published. A lot of magazines were published. So when I was a kid in the early 70s, I was able to buy every week a dozen of magazines with comics from all over the world. So yes, it was a great influence on me, and I started with reading a lot of kids comics back then.
And that's what I found really interesting about your work, as that you have partly also published in Partisan Post, which is like your new book, which has been published in German. With I will just show it here, Partisan Post. It's published by Bahoe Books in Vienna. It's a collection of stories mainly or only from the wartime, when I'm
Yes, yes,
correct.
yes.
Yes, so it's wartime stories in Belgrade, in Yugoslavia. And so it's a lot of stories, not only about the Second World War seen from the Yugoslav perspective, but also a lot about, that might be interesting for the German reader or German language reader, it's a lot about Nazis too, a lot about Nazi occupation. And it's very interesting because many people in Germany have forgotten about the facts that Nazi occupation was not only in Poland or in Russia, but also in other parts of Europe as well. And that's what I think is, from the German or Austrian perspective, a great work of you by your side to introduce these stories. But referring to your last comments on the Yugoslavian scene, there's also a story about a forgotten artist, a comic artist, who was killed by the Nazis in the war, in wartime. So I suppose it was for you a lot of research, not only about wartime Yugoslavia, but also about these forgotten artists of the time. So how did you find him? Can you tell us about his fate? I'll just look up the story.
Uh-huh. Yes, well, actually, it's the cartoonist who was active during the Nazi occupation, but he was, if you mean the story about Veljko Kockar, who is
Exactly, yeah.
a Serbian cartoonist, he was actually killed, shot after the liberation of Belgrade, and he was shot by the new government because he allegedly collaborated with the Nazis, which turned out to be a wrong information. So he was basically killed for nothing. I mean, it was at the time when all of the publications in Yugoslavia were actually uh, censored by the Nazi
Yes.
government.
Hmm.
But he never did anything which would have anything to do with Nazi propaganda or
Yes.
any other such stuff. So yes, I tried together with some colleagues who were like comics historians. We tried to get his the story about Veljko Kockar, this cartoonist, and especially because the information about him were actually put under the carpet after the war was over, because the government was actually embarrassed because he was basically shot for nothing. It was very shortly after the end of the war, so there was a kind of a big confusion, and some of the people would lost their life for nothing. Some were actually prosecuted for a reason, sometimes for a good reason. But it was a moment where a lot of things were going on. So I tried to actually go behind this story. I searched through the archives, and I was looking for the whole story, and it was also shown in the film, which was released only a couple of years ago, and which is called "The Final Adventure of Cactus Kid." Cactus Kid is
Yeah,
its main character.
that's a great film. We showed it in Berlin in the end of February, early March, and in mid March it was. Yeah, and I was just wanted to ask you that what I think really interesting in the book, and it's in the film, it's the same, but we mainly talk about the book now. That way, you do a lot of research, but what surprised me, and I was really touched by it, is the way you discover things. So it's really very often you have the impression, I don't know if it's true, but it seems like you are walking on a flea market and you're looking through the piles, and then you discover an item from the time, like maybe like German photographs by a German soldier, or even like a book for traffic rules in Nazi time, which is things I've never seen here in Germany. So I was totally impressed. And then you build the stories around it from a Yugoslav or Serbian perspective. So is it true? Is it really like this a bit of a random approach that you're scanning different kinds of piles, old bookstores, souvenir shops for these things to find something?
Yes, it's one of my favorite thing to do. I like to research. I like to find the things which are forgotten, and very often I find these things at the flea markets. I think flea markets are a really perfect place because you can find a lot of things which are just piled up, and a lot of the times people they just throw out things that they don't need, and sometimes you can find really great stuff. And also I think if you want to show what happened in some for example in some time frame, as it was during the Second World War, sometimes, or maybe the best thing that you can do is actually to take care about the things which are marginal things, mostly not very well known by the history. And as you said, it's sometimes I would find just the things which are almost incredible, incredible documents at the flea markets. And the good thing is that I have a very good flea market here in Pančevo, where I live. And also, it's the town of which, until the 1944, it's half of the population were the German minority.
See,
and how were the Serbs with a lot of different nationalities. It's a multicultural surroundings with more than 20 different nations living in that area. So it's you can find a lot of really interesting stuff. As I said, I'm especially interested into things which are forgotten because I think the history books, the books which are officially dealing with the historical times, they are something like the closed container. It's already finished. You have the history which is defined by somebody. But if you want to really find out about the life details, about all the perspective of the people who lived in some other time, it's actually you have to search for the personal visions, and very often it's the things which are left after some common people, after the people who were not big historical figures, but who have seen these facts through their own vision, through their own eyes, and it's basically most of the stories from Partisan and Post
yeah.
is about.
Hmm. Hmm.
So, so it's like an alternative history. It's not the history that
Exactly.
you will find
It's
in.
a social history. It's a very individual history. For example, I was very touched because I lived for a long time in Hungary, and I speak Hungarian. That's the story of Miklos Radnoti in it, which who's very famous in Hungary and who was killed in the wartime in '44, which really touched me. But all the other stories from random people where you found the diaries and their notes. So how do people in Serbia today react to these stories? I mean, like the old generation who fought in the war, and even people who were born in the war. I mean, they are old now. I mean, they don't remember maybe. So how do people nowadays react to your stories when you if you show them?
Yeah, it's interesting because it's all most of the things which I described in my comics are kind of a personal history. So it's the history of the normal people, the small people. Um, Very often it's based on some of the documents that I find on a flea market. For example, in one of the stories, I'm describing a kind of a diary that I have found by a man that I know just by his name, Radoslav. I don't even know his second name. But he lived in Belgrade during the bombing of 1944, which was the Allies' bombing of Belgrade, the occupied Belgrade. Belgrade was bombed by the Nazis in 41, and it was bombed several times by the Allies. It's a complicated story, but anyway, this man whose writings I have found was so much in shock that he went home, I guess, and he took a piece of paper and he described all of his life. So that was the story which I used as a starting point for my for the comic, and so I illustrated basically the life of an anonymous man who lived in Belgrade in the 1940s. Uh, I guess it's always today people they are a little bit far away from these times, just like anywhere, and especially the young people they hardly even know what happened. And one of the stories is about for example, is about the Jewish girl who managed to send her letters. Uh, Her name is Hilda Deitch. She just managed to send some letters from the concentration camp, which Nazis have built in the middle of Belgrade, in the town center. It was one of the few European towns with a concentration camp, which was almost right in the center of the town. So this story was almost completely forgotten. These letters were found in the 1990s, and it's just short letters. But usually we don't have something like that. It's a direct, directly connected with what she experienced in a concentration camp. So for me, it was very powerful, especially because she was young, very energetic, very talented person, and she explained it with a kind of a self-ironic approach.
Very honest, very honest. Yeah, it's the first story in the book. It's really touching because it's so direct. You just, as if you were there, and very critical on herself and the other people, totally reflecting all the time. It's really, really impressive. Yeah.
And for example, that story about Hilda Deitch, it became very much important in the more recent years. And the Serbian government have published it in the form of a book in collaboration with the Israeli embassy in Belgrade. They published it in a book which was distributed for free to school children in Serbia. So it's the first time that a comic became a sort of an educational tool in some way. So this comic, which is supposed to also be part of the school books since the next school year.
Yeah, very good. That's really wonderful to hear. Yeah, I have a question about the way you draw. Your drawings are, as you said, like you taught yourself. I mean, you're taught by exercise, but you have your influences. I know you are a great fan and personal friend of Mr. Crumb. What I like about your drawings, it's very intense. It's very atmospheric. And it's a bit melancholic, a bit darkish, a bit wild. So is there a lot of planning involved when you start, or do you just like because you have the material? I mean, you are like the journalist, you have the scenario prepared, and then you go to draw it. Could you shortly describe us how do you do that? Is it spontaneously or very exactly planned?
Yeah, it is planned, but then it is also spontaneous, of course, because I like it to be a kind of expressive, a kind of spontaneous, and not too much projected, because I think it kills the story. But with my background as a journalist, I also like to structure the stories so that they are readable and quite understandable, maybe on the first reading. And yes, one of the influences was Robert Crumb. Also because he had this kind of an approach which is more coming from somewhere from the back of his head. It's not something which is completely planned. It's also connected with the dream reality, with imagination, and
subconscious.
yes, with subconscious material. And I think it's a really a big influence, actually, to try to record something which is inside. Also, I think one of the very interesting thing for me is to go behind the collective subconsciousness, because I believe that we as a people, as a personalities, as a single human beings, we have our own subconscious material which is popping out through what we are and what we produce as art, or the way that we communicate with the other people. But we also have this backpack of the collective subconsciousness. And I think it's also something which interested me in this book about which is based on World War II, because I think that it was like a collective, the collective mind of the humankind was in some disturbed and special state during the Second World War. It was just not the normal way that humans as a whole were functioning. They were experiencing some sort of collective hallucination, I should say. And I found some similarities with what we experience right now during the coronavirus crisis.
That's a thanks for the bridge, because that was actually the last question, because we're running out of time. I wanted to ask you, because as you are a reporter, like a comic artist reporter, or like a graphic reporter too, in your stories, you prefer to tell real stories, rediscovered stories, new stories. You did something already directly after you came back from Berlin, where it was, I wouldn't tell here because you did it already. It's a very advantageous way back to Serbia, just before Corona breakout. And so I wanted to ask you, do you think that it's really a good thing for you as a comic author that reality is somewhat much more extreme than the things you could think of? It's always like in Corona's example, again, like the Second World War in your other stories, but now Corona, it's so crazy you never would think about it.
Yes, it's the reason why I like to deal with reality, with the real problems, with the real people and the real situations. It's because the reality is much weirder than something that you can imagine, that you can fantasize about. It is much more surrealistic than a surrealistic movement could have imagined. Something can happen.
Yeah,
so
true.
yes, I think for me this situation with coronavirus is very inspirational. I think it's interesting to look at from the close, because it's connected with the collective consciousness and some kind of mass hallucination that again that is happening to our race, I should say, human race, is again in a quite strange way of some kind of weird dream.
I see. So that means that's something we can expect from your side, hopefully, in some near future, some new stuff. So finally, I have to say thank you very much, Saša, for all this information. It was a very interesting interview. I can recommend everybody watching to take a look at Partisan Post and all the other works by Aleksandar Zograf, aka Saša Rakezić. Yes, and hope to see you soon, be it in Skype or via telephone, or hopefully this year in person. I would be very glad.
Yes, Axel, thank you very much. It was a pleasure, and I hope that you will come to Pančevo to see.
I plan it. Oh, definitely.
At least the flea market. Flea market is a must.
Definitely, yeah, we'll go there. So take care. Yeah, okay. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Bye.
Mamma mia floreresem se spale di dimineață, vende flori le pe piață, vende flori le pe piață.